there! Tonight, we go into something a little darker than your usual bedtime story. You are a skilled healer in ancient Korea, armed with centuries of medical wisdom, ready to save lives and earn respect. But here is the truth. You probably won't survive your first royal appointment. Welcome to a world where curing the wrong person could cost you your head, quite literally. So, now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. You're standing in the corridors of Gyeongbok Palace during the early Joseon Dynasty, around 1400. The silk-clad walls seem to whisper warnings as you clutch your leather medical bag filled with precious herbs and jade acupuncture needles. You've been summoned to treat King Taejong, and every footstep echoes like a countdown to either glory or execution. Court physicians in Korean dynasties lived in a perpetual state of terror that would make modern malpractice lawsuits look like gentle suggestions. When you accepted the position of royal doctor, you weren't just signing up for prestige and fancy robes. You were essentially volunteering for a game of medical Russian roulette, where the stakes were always your life. The royal medical system operated on a simple, terrifying principle. Success meant temporary safety. Failure meant immediate death. There was no middle ground, no learning curve, no better luck next time. If the king developed a headache after your herbal treatment, you might find yourself accused of attempted assassination. If a royal concubine died in childbirth despite your best efforts, the executioner's blade awaited your neck before dawn. Consider the case of Dr. Ho Jun's predecessor, whose name history conveniently forgot, probably because mentioning failed royal physicians was considered bad luck. This unfortunate soul treated King Sanjo's chronic stomach ailments with a carefully prepared mixture of ginseng and deer antler. The king's condition worsened overnight, and by sunrise, the physician had been dragged to the courtyard and beheaded for poisoning the dragon throne. His crime? Following the exact same treatment protocol that had worked perfectly for dozens of other patients. The paranoia surrounding royal medicine reached absurd heights during times of political instability. Court physicians were required to taste every medicine before administering it, not for quality control, but to prove they weren't assassins. Imagine explaining to your medical school professors that your job description included professional poison tester. You'd pre-taste bitter herbal concoctions, swallow samples of powdered tiger bone, and gulp down suspicious-looking tinctures while the entire royal court watched for signs of your imminent demise. But here's where things get deliciously ironic. The constant fear of execution actually made Korean court physicians some of the most innovative medical practitioners in Asia. When your life depends on treatment success, you tend to get creative fast. They developed incredibly sophisticated diagnostic techniques, maintained detailed patient records, and created complex herbal formulations that would make modern pharmacologists weep with envy. The royal medical examination system was legendarily brutal. Prospective court physicians faced a 3-day ordeal that would break most modern medical students. Day 1, recite from memory the complete texts of classical Chinese medical treatises while blindfolded. Day 2, diagnose mysterious ailments presented by actors pretending to be patients, knowing that incorrect diagnoses would result in immediate disqualification and potential charges of incompetence. Day 3, prepare complex herbal medicines under the watchful eyes of current court physicians, any of whom could declare your work inadequate and end your career before it began. The psychological pressure created a peculiar breed of medical practitioner, part healer, part political survivor, part performance artist. Court physicians learned to read not just pulse rates and tongue colors, but also the subtle facial expressions of royal family members, the shifting alliances among court officials, and the dangerous undercurrents of palace politics. Your medical bag needed to contain not just healing herbs, but also an intimate understanding of who wanted whom dead, and why. Royal medical consultations resembled elaborate theatrical performances more than clinical examinations. The physician would arrive with a retinue of assistants carrying silk-wrapped medical instruments, exotic herbs in jade containers, and scrolls containing astrological charts calculated to determine the most auspicious treatment timing. Everything had to appear mystical, authoritative, and impressively expensive, because if your medicine looked too simple, the royals might question whether you were truly worth keeping alive. The doctrine of royal medical infallibility created impossible contradictions. If a treatment worked, the success belonged to the patient's superior constitution and divine mandate. If it failed, the failure belonged entirely to the physician's inadequacy. Court doctors learned to navigate this twisted logic by developing elaborate explanations for every possible outcome. A successful treatment demonstrated their exceptional skill and the patient's noble spirit working in harmony. An unsuccessful treatment revealed external evil influences, improper dietary habits, or the patient's failure to maintain sufficient spiritual purity during the healing process. Even successful court physicians lived with constant anxiety. Dr. Hyo-jun, perhaps the most famous medical figure in Korean history, spent decades walking the razor's edge between professional triumphs and political disaster. Despite revolutionizing Korean medicine and writing texts still studied today, he knew that a single diagnostic mistake, one poorly timed treatment recommendation, or even an unlucky coincidence could transform him from revered healer to executed traitor overnight. The really twisted part? Many court physicians genuinely loved medicine and felt called to heal. But the royal appointment system meant that the most talented healers were often the ones who ended up dead. It was a perfect recipe for destroying the very medical expertise the kingdom desperately needed to survive. The Confucian social order that governed Korean dynasties created a medical hierarchy so rigid and punitive that practicing medicine often felt like committing slow-motion social suicide. You see, in the carefully structured world of Joseon society, everyone had their designated place, and stepping outside those boundaries, even to save lives, could result in disgrace, exile, or worse. All right now, pause and picture yourself as a brilliant healer born into the merchant class around 1450. You've mastered the art of pulse diagnosis, can identify hundreds of medicinal herbs by scent alone, and possess an intuitive understanding of human anatomy that would impress modern medical schools. There's just one tiny problem. According to Confucian doctrine, your social status makes you fundamentally unqualified to practice noble medicine on anyone above your station. Treating a scholar's fever could land you in prison for presumption. Healing a government official's broken arm might result in charges of exceeding your social boundaries. The Confucian medical establishment operated on the delightfully contradictory principle that healing knowledge should be both widely available for the common good and strictly restricted according to social class. Scholars who had never touched a patient could theoretically outrank experienced healers simply by virtue of their education in classical Chinese texts. It was like having hospital administrators with no medical training making life and death decisions, which, come to think of it, isn't entirely foreign to modern healthcare either. The most absurd manifestation of this hierarchy appeared in the official medical examination system. Candidates were tested more extensively on their knowledge of Confucian philosophy and classical literature than on actual medical skills. You could diagnose rare diseases with supernatural accuracy, but if you couldn't recite lengthy passages from Mencius or discuss the moral implications of the five elements theory, you'd be considered unfit for serious medical practice. Meanwhile, scholarly dilettantes who could barely distinguish ginseng from garlic root were awarded prestigious medical positions based solely on their literary accomplishments. This created a bizarre medical caste system where theoretical knowledge trumped practical experience every single time. The highest-ranking medical officials were often scholars who viewed medicine as an intellectual exercise rather than a hands-on healing art. They'd spend hours debating the philosophical implications of treating kidney disorders, while actual patients writhe in agony, waiting for someone with genuine medical skills to ignore protocol and provide real treatment. Lower-class healers developed ingenious workarounds to circumvent these restrictions. They'd operate informal medical networks, passing treatment knowledge through coded conversations and seemingly innocent social gatherings. A barber might casually mention that certain herbs helped his neighbor's cough, while a merchant would offhandedly note that specific acupuncture points seemed to relieve his wife's headaches. This underground medical intelligence network kept practical healing knowledge alive despite official suppression. The punishment for crossing class boundaries in medical practice could be spectacularly harsh. Records from the mid-Joseon period describe a talented folk healer named Kim, who successfully treated a county magistrate's son for what was probably appendicitis. Instead of gratitude, Kim received 20 lashes and permanent banishment from his village for the crime of medical presumption. The magistrate's son made a full recovery, but Kim died in exile 3 months later, his healing knowledge lost forever. Women faced particularly brutal restrictions within this medical hierarchy. Female healers, regardless of their skill level, were automatically classified below male practitioners of any social class. A noblewoman with extensive medical knowledge ranked below a male commoner who'd memorized a few herbal recipes. This wasn't just social snobbery, it was codified law backed by severe penalties for violations. The scholarly medical establishment's obsession with classical Chinese medical texts created another layer of professional danger. Korean folk medicine had developed unique treatments, perfectly adapted to local climate, diet, and genetic factors. But Confucian medical orthodoxy demanded strict adherence to Chinese medical classics, even when those treatments proved ineffective or harmful in Korean contexts. Healers who dared to modify classical prescriptions based on practical experience were accused of corrupting sacred medical knowledge. Dr. Yu Ite, a physician working during the late 16th century, documented this conflict in his private journals. He discovered that Korean patients responded better to modified dosages of certain Chinese herbal formulas. But presenting this research publicly would have meant challenging the infallibility of classical medical texts, essentially committing intellectual heresy. He secretly treated patients with his improved methods while publicly teaching the orthodox approaches, living in constant fear that someone would notice the discrepancy and report him to authorities. The Confucian medical hierarchy also created dangerous delays in emergency treatment. If a high-ranking official fell seriously ill, protocol demanded that only physicians of appropriate social status could provide care. Lower-class healers with superior emergency medical skills had to stand aside, while scholarly physicians fumbled through treatments they'd only read about in books. People literally died waiting for socially acceptable medical care. This rigid system produced some genuinely tragic ironies. The most knowledgeable healers often came from families with generations of practical medical experience, but their low social status prevented them from officially practicing medicine. Meanwhile, newly minted scholarly physicians with impressive credentials but minimal hands-on experience were elevated to positions of medical authority. It was like forcing experienced surgeons to work as hospital janitors while promoting literature professors to head the surgery department. The psychological toll on competent healers trapped in this system was enormous. Imagine possessing life-saving knowledge, but being legally prohibited from using it based on the accident of your birth. Many talented folk healers developed elaborate deceptions to practice medicine indirectly, opening herb shops, working as bathhouse attendants, or becoming servants in wealthy households where they could provide informal medical advice disguised as general wellness tips. Some physicians attempted to game the system by accumulating scholarly credentials while maintaining their practical medical skills. This required mastering two completely different knowledge systems simultaneously: the theoretical frameworks demanded by Confucian orthodoxy and the hands-on healing techniques that actually worked. These medical double agents lived in constant fear of exposure, knowing that any inconsistency between their scholarly pronouncements and practical treatments could destroy their careers and endanger their lives. The most successful physicians learned to navigate this treacherous social landscape by becoming master code switchers. They discuss medical philosophy in appropriately scholarly language during official examinations, then quietly apply effective folk remedies when treating actual patients. This required not just medical expertise, but also sophisticated political skills and nerves of steel. You've mastered the art of reading pulses. Your herbal preparations could revive the nearly dead, and your diagnostic skills rival those of any physician in the kingdom. But there's something you haven't quite grasped yet. In Korean dynastic medicine, your greatest enemy isn't disease or ignorance. It's the whispered word poison, followed by your name, a combination that transforms you from healer to condemned assassin faster than you can say ginseng root. The poison accusation was the nuclear option of Korean court politics, and physicians found themselves perpetually in the blast radius. Any unexplained illness, sudden death, or even mysterious recovery could trigger suspicions that would destroy medical careers and end lives with ruthless efficiency. The logic was beautifully simple and completely insane. If someone died after receiving medical treatment, the physician must have poisoned them. If someone recovered too quickly, the physician must have initially poisoned them and then provided the antidote to avoid suspicion. The poison accusation was the nuclear option of Korean court politics, and physicians found themselves perpetually in the blast radius. Any unexplained illness, sudden death, or even mysterious recovery could trigger suspicions that would destroy medical careers and end lives with ruthless efficiency. The logic was beautifully simple and completely insane. If someone died after receiving medical treatment, the physician must have poisoned them. If someone recovered too quickly, the physician must have initially poisoned them and then provided the antidote to avoid suspicion. Consider the career trajectory of Dr. Song Il-mun, a court physician during King Sejong's reign. For 15 years, he'd successfully treated royal family members, earning respect and accumulating wealth. Then, Princess Jungso developed severe stomach cramps 3 days after consuming his herbal tonic for menstrual irregularities. Despite the fact that she'd also eaten questionable seafood at a court banquet, changed her diet dramatically, and been under extreme stress from political negotiations, Dr. Song found himself accused of attempted regicide through poisoning. The investigation process would have impressed modern conspiracy theorists with its thoroughness and complete disregard for actual evidence. Court officials examined every ingredient in Dr. Seong's tonic, interviewed his suppliers, analyzed his recent financial transactions, and questioned his servants about suspicious behavior. They discovered that he'd purchased mercury from a Chinese trader 6 months earlier, obviously for poisoning purposes, despite mercury being a standard ingredient in legitimate Korean medical preparations. The really diabolical aspect of poison accusations was their unfalsifiability. If you could prove your innocence by showing that your medicines contained only beneficial ingredients, accusers would claim you'd switched the poison for harmless substances after the attack. If patients recovered after taking your treatments, that proved you'd provided antidotes to cover your tracks. If they died, that proved the poison had worked as intended. You literally could not win. Court physicians developed elaborate protective strategies that transformed medical practice into a form of performance art designed to prevent poison accusations. They'd prepare medicines in full view of witnesses, invite observers to smell and taste ingredients, and maintain detailed written records of every component used in their formulations. Some physicians required patients to sign documents acknowledging that treatments contained no poisonous substances, which was about as legally useful as you'd expect in a system where royal displeasure trumped written contracts. The poison paranoia reached absurd heights during periods of political instability. Court physicians treating members of rival political factions had to navigate accusations from multiple directions simultaneously. If you successfully treated a minister from the Western faction, Eastern faction members might accuse you of poisoning their political opponents to weaken them for future attacks. If that same minister later died from unrelated causes, you'd face murder charges from his supporters who assumed your earlier treatment had been a slow-acting poison. Dr. Heo Jun's medical records, preserved in the Royal Archives, reveal the exhausting mental gymnastics required to avoid poison accusations. For every patient, he'd document not just symptoms and treatments, but also detailed explanations of why each ingredient was necessary, how it would interact with the patient's constitution, and what alternative treatments he'd considered and rejected. His case notes read like legal briefs prepared by someone expecting to defend themselves in court at any moment. The accusation process itself was designed to be as terrifying as possible. Suspected physician poisoners were arrested without warning, usually at night, and immediately separated from their families and colleagues. The interrogation methods combined traditional Korean judicial torture with medical-specific questioning designed to trap physicians in contradictions about their treatments. Interrogators would demand detailed explanations of medical theories while simultaneously inflicting pain, hoping to catch physicians in inconsistencies that could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Female physicians faced particularly vicious poison accusations because traditional Korean gender roles made their medical knowledge seem inherently suspicious. A woman who understood which herbs could heal was obviously equally capable of knowing which herbs could kill. The line between wise woman and witch was thin enough to be invisible, especially when political convenience demanded finding a scapegoat for mysterious deaths or illnesses. The economic incentives surrounding poison accusations created a thriving cottage industry of professional accusers. Court officials who successfully exposed physician poisoners could expect career advancement, financial rewards, and enhanced political influence. This created a perverse system where ambitious courtiers actively looked for opportunities to destroy medical practitioners, turning every therapeutic failure into a potential political victory. The psychological impact on the medical profession was devastating. Competent physicians began refusing to treat high-risk patients, not because the cases were medically challenging, but because unsuccessful outcomes would likely result in poison accusations. The most skilled healers often worked exclusively with commoners, while mediocre physicians with superior political connections dominated court medicine. Some physicians attempted to insure themselves against poison accusations by maintaining detailed correspondence with colleagues about their cases. If accusations arose, they could produce letters demonstrating that other medical professionals had endorsed their treatment approaches. This created a complex network of medical mutual protection societies where physicians would formally validate each other's work to provide legal cover against future accusations. The paranoia became so intense that successful treatments sometimes triggered more suspicion than failures. If you cured someone too quickly or effectively, observers might wonder whether you'd caused the original illness to demonstrate your healing abilities. Dr. Kim Dok-gun faced exactly this accusation after rapidly curing a court official's mysterious fever using an innovative combination of acupuncture and herbal medicine. His success was interpreted as evidence that he'd initially poisoned the patient and then provided theatrical treatment to avoid suspicion. Remember that damp wool tunic from earlier? Well, Korean court physicians learned to dress as conservatively and unremarkably as possible to avoid standing out in ways that might invite poison accusations. Flashy clothes, expensive accessories, or even unusually good health could be interpreted as signs of suspicious wealth or knowledge of life-extending poisons. The medical landscape of Korean dynasties resembled a battlefield where competing healing philosophies waged war with the intensity of religious crusades, and physicians caught between these ideological armies often found themselves crushed by the very knowledge they'd spent lifetimes accumulating. You're practicing medicine in a world where choosing the wrong therapeutic approach could brand you as either a dangerous foreign infiltrator or a backward traditionalist, both potentially fatal designations. Chinese traditional medicine arrived in Korea like a conquering army, complete with its own ideology, vocabulary, and demands for absolute loyalty. The classical Chinese medical texts, the Huangdi Neijing, the Shanghan Lun, the Benkao Bangmu, weren't just reference books. They were sacred scriptures that demanded complete adherence. Korean physicians who dared to question Chinese medical orthodoxy, or, God forbid, suggest that Korean folk remedies might sometimes prove superior, found themselves accused of medical heresy, with consequences ranging from professional destruction to physical elimination. But here's where the situation became deliciously complicated. Korean folk medicine had been quietly saving lives for centuries before Chinese medical texts ever crossed the peninsula's borders. Korean healers had developed sophisticated treatments using local plants, minerals, and techniques perfectly adapted to Korean climate, diet, and genetic factors. These weren't primitive folk remedies. They were refined therapeutic systems that often outperformed imported Chinese treatments. Dr. Yang Yesu, practicing during the early Joseon period, discovered this conflict firsthand when treating the chronic joint pain that plagued many Korean officials during the harsh winter months. Chinese medical texts recommended specific herbal formulas designed for the warmer, more humid Chinese climate. Korean folk tradition used different herbs and preparation methods that accounted for Korea's brutal winters and different dietary patterns. Yang's private notes, discovered centuries later, reveal his dangerous secret. Korean folk remedies worked better, But acknowledging this publicly would have destroyed his career. The medical philosophy wars created impossible situations for practicing physicians. Court officials demanded treatments based on classical Chinese medical theory, complete with proper terminology and theoretical justifications. But patients, especially those paying with their own money, wanted treatments that actually worked. Physicians learned to perform elaborate intellectual contortions, publicly describing their treatments using Chinese medical language, while secretly incorporating Korean folk techniques. The conflict between medical philosophies wasn't just academic, it was literally deadly. Chinese medical theory emphasized balance and gradual treatment approaches that worked well for chronic conditions and stable environments. Korean folk medicine had developed more aggressive, immediate interventions necessary for surviving harsh winters, food shortages, and the unique disease patterns that emerged from Korea's geographical isolation. When Chinese-trained physicians applied gentle, gradual treatments to Korean patients facing life-threatening conditions, people died while waiting for theoretical balance to restore their health. Korean medical innovators who attempted to bridge these philosophical gaps faced persecution from multiple directions. Chinese medical purists accused them of corrupting sacred healing knowledge with primitive folk superstitions. Korean traditionalists viewed them as traitors who'd abandoned ancestral wisdom for foreign nonsense. The political establishment saw them as dangerous freethinkers whose intellectual independence might extend to other areas of social order. The philosophical battle lines were drawn with religious intensity. Chinese medical theory was based on elaborate theoretical frameworks involving qi circulation, five-element correspondences, and complex diagnostic systems that required years of study to master. Korean folk medicine relied more heavily on empirical observation, practical experimentation, and treatment approaches passed down through generations of hands-on experience. These weren't just different medical approaches. They represented fundamentally different ways of understanding reality itself. Dr. Hell Yoon's masterwork, the Dongui Bogum, represented a dangerous attempt to synthesize Chinese medical theory with Korean practical experience. While history remembers this as a crowning achievement of Korean medicine, contemporary physicians understood it as an incredibly risky political statement. Hell Yoon was essentially arguing that Korean medical knowledge could improve upon Chinese classical texts, an assertion that bordered on cultural treason. The persecution of medical synthesizers took various forms, from subtle professional sabotage to outright violence. Physicians who published treatments combining Chinese and Korean approaches might find their patient referrals mysteriously disappearing, their herb suppliers refusing to sell to them, or their students recruited away by orthodox practitioners. More direct persecution included formal charges of practicing unauthorized medicine, accusations of spreading foreign contamination, or claims that mixed medical approaches constituted political disloyalty. Regional medical variations created additional layers of philosophical conflict. Northern Korean provinces, closer to Chinese borders, tended towards stricter adherence to Chinese medical orthodoxy. Southern regions, with stronger connections to indigenous Korean traditions, maintained more tolerance for folk medicine practices. Physicians traveling between regions had to completely alter their treatment approaches to avoid accusations of practicing inappropriate medicine. The economic dimensions of these medical philosophy wars were staggering. Chinese medical texts were expensive imports that required substantial financial investment to acquire and study. Korean folk medical knowledge was often freely shared within communities and passed down through family networks. This created class-based medical conflicts where wealthy physicians could afford Chinese medical education while poor healers relied on Korean traditional knowledge. The medical establishment used these economic barriers to enforce philosophical orthodoxy. If you couldn't afford proper Chinese medical texts, you obviously weren't qualified to practice serious medicine. Medical schools became battlegrounds where competing philosophies fought for institutional control. Students caught between orthodox Chinese medical instruction and effective Korean folk techniques lived in constant fear of expressing the wrong medical opinion at the wrong time. Examination questions were designed to identify students with dangerously independent thinking or excessive attachment to Korean traditional approaches. The most successful physicians learned to become medical chameleons, shifting between philosophical frameworks depending on their audience and circumstances. They'd discuss Chinese medical theory in scholarly settings, apply Korean folk techniques in private practice, and develop elaborate explanations for why their treatments worked within whatever theoretical framework their listeners preferred. This required not just medical knowledge, but sophisticated political awareness and performance skills that rivaled professional actors. Some physicians attempted to escape these philosophical conflicts by specializing in areas where Chinese and Korean approaches overlapped, such as basic herbal medicine or simple acupuncture techniques. But even these seemingly safe specializations could become politically dangerous when medical fashion shifted or new orthodox interpretations emerged from Chinese medical academies. The women healers of Korean dynasties operated in a shadow world, so dangerous that their very existence was essentially illegal, yet so necessary that even the most rigid Confucian officials secretly relied on their forbidden expertise. You're entering a realm where gender, medicine, and survival intersected in ways that would make modern medical ethicists weep, or possibly laugh hysterically at the sheer absurdity of it all. Picture yourself as a woman in 15th century Korea with an intuitive understanding of childbirth complications, herbal remedies, and diagnostic techniques that could shame university-trained physicians. Congratulations! You've just become one of the most wanted criminals in the kingdom. Not because you're harming people, but because you're healing them while possessing the wrong chromosomes. The Korean medical establishment had decided that women's hands were inherently polluted, their minds incapable of understanding complex medical theory, and their presence around sick people fundamentally dangerous to the natural order. The legal restrictions on female medical practice were breathtakingly comprehensive. Women couldn't officially study medicine, couldn't take medical examinations, couldn't treat patients of higher social rank, couldn't own medical texts, couldn't purchase certain medicinal herbs, and couldn't even discuss medical theories in public without risking charges of exceeding their proper social boundaries. Basically, if it involved healing and you happened to be female, it was probably illegal. But here's the delicious irony that kept this underground medical network thriving. Korean women were the only people in the kingdom with extensive practical experience in the most crucial areas of healthcare. Childbirth, infant care, women's reproductive health, herbal preparation, wound treatment, and end-of-life care were all areas where women had developed expertise through necessity, while male physicians maintained scholarly distance from these impure aspects of medical practice. The female medical underground operated through networks that would have impressed modern intelligence agencies with their sophistication and security measures. Information traveled through seemingly innocent social gatherings, sewing circles where women shared knowledge about herbs that prevented miscarriages, market conversations where housewives casually mentioned remedies for children's fevers, religious ceremonies where elderly women passed down diagnostic techniques disguised as folk wisdom. Midwifery represented the most dangerous intersection of female medical practice and official persecution. Every woman who assisted in childbirth was technically practicing medicine without authorization, but attempting to eliminate female birth attendants would have created a demographic catastrophe. The compromise solution was typically Korean in its elegant cruelty. Women could assist in childbirth, but they bore complete legal responsibility for any complications. If mother or child died, the midwife faced charges ranging from negligent homicide to practicing unauthorized medicine. The case of Grandmother Sook, recorded in court documents from 1456, illustrates the impossible position of female healers. She'd successfully assisted in over 300 births during her 40-year career, developing techniques for managing breech presentations and postpartum hemorrhaging that saved countless lives. When a wealthy merchant's wife died from complications during a difficult delivery, complications that modern medicine would recognize as unavoidable given the available technology, Grandmother Sook was charged with murder through medical incompetence. The fact that she'd saved hundreds of other women's lives was irrelevant. One failure was enough to destroy her. Female physicians developed ingenious methods for circumventing legal restrictions on their practice. Some disguised their medical activities as religious duties, claiming divine inspiration for their healing knowledge. Others worked through male relatives who would officially take credit for treatments while the women provided the actual medical expertise. The most clever female healers established themselves as herb sellers or food preparers, dispensing medical advice disguised as cooking tips or nutritional guidance. The persecution of female medical practitioners often took on characteristics of witch trials, complete with accusations of supernatural powers and demonic associations. A woman who successfully treated conditions that baffled male physicians might find herself accused of using evil magic rather than superior medical knowledge. The logic was impeccable in its twisted simplicity. If a woman could accomplish medical feats beyond male capabilities, she must be using forbidden supernatural assistance. Korean court records reveal dozens of cases where female healers were tortured to extract confessions about their supposedly magical medical methods. The interrogators genuinely couldn't comprehend that women might possess legitimate medical knowledge superior to male physicians, so they assumed supernatural explanations. Women who'd spent decades perfecting herbal formulations and diagnostic techniques found themselves accused of consorting with demons, practicing witchcraft, or receiving medical knowledge from evil spirits. The economic persecution of female healers was equally systematic and brutal. Women couldn't legally own the tools of medical practice: scales for measuring herbs, acupuncture needles, medical texts, or even certain medicinal plants. They had to work through male intermediaries for basic supplies, creating vulnerability to economic manipulation and blackmail. If a woman's male sponsor decided to withdraw support, her medical practice would collapse overnight. Class distinctions created additional layers of danger for female healers. Aristocratic women who practiced medicine faced accusations of degrading their social status through inappropriate manual labor. Common women who treated patients above their station risked charges of social presumption and exceeding proper boundaries. There was literally no safe social space for female medical practice within the official Korean class system. Some women attempted to gain legitimacy by restricting their practice to exclusively female patients, but even this created legal complications. Official medical theory held that women's bodies were fundamentally different from men's in ways that made female medical knowledge irrelevant to broader medical understanding. Female physicians were simultaneously accused of knowing too little about general medicine to treat anyone safely, and knowing too much about female-specific conditions to avoid suspicion of practicing forbidden arts. The underground female medical networks developed sophisticated training systems that rivaled formal medical education. Experienced healers would take on young apprentices, teaching them through hands-on experience while maintaining strict secrecy about the educational process. These informal medical schools produced healers with practical skills that often exceeded those of officially trained male physicians, but their very existence was criminal. Remember that royal medical examination system we discussed earlier? Female healers faced an even more brutal testing process, conducted entirely in secret. Senior women would evaluate newcomers through elaborate practical examinations involving real patients with genuine medical emergencies. Failure meant not just career disappointment, but potential exposure of the entire underground network. Success meant acceptance into a sisterhood, bound together by shared criminal activity and mutual dependence for survival. The psychological toll on female healers was extraordinary. They possessed life-saving knowledge, but lived in constant fear of discovery and persecution. Many developed elaborate double lives, maintaining public personas as conventional housewives while secretly operating sophisticated medical practices. The stress of this deception, combined with the constant threat of exposure, created unique forms of anxiety that affected their own health even as they successfully treated others. When plague struck Korean dynasties, medical professionals transformed from respected healers into convenient scapegoats faster than you could say bubonic, and the irony was thick enough to cut with a surgical knife. You're now entering the twisted world of epidemic medicine, where the very people risking their lives to combat disease became the primary targets of blame, persecution, and violence from the communities they were desperately trying to save. The arrival of epidemic disease in Korean villages created a predictable pattern that would have been darkly comedic if it weren't so consistently deadly for medical practitioners. First, mysterious illness would appear, perhaps smallpox from Chinese traders, cholera from contaminated water sources, or typhus from military encampments. Second, local officials would frantically summon every available physician to combat the outbreak. Third, when the disease inevitably spread despite medical intervention, those same officials would turn on the physicians with accusations of causing, spreading, or deliberately prolonging the epidemic for personal profit. Dr. Lee Myung-han's journal from the 1592 cholera outbreak provides a chilling first-hand account of medical scapegoating in action. He'd volunteered to treat plague victims in a remote mountain village, working 18-hour days preparing herbal medicines and treating patients with rudimentary quarantine techniques. When the death toll continued climbing despite his efforts, villagers began whispering that his presence had brought the disease. Within days, whispers became accusations. Accusations became mob violence, and Dr. Lee found himself fleeing from the very people he'd been trying to save. The medical logic of plague scapegoating was both sophisticated and completely insane. Community leaders needed someone to blame for catastrophic mortality rates that threatened village survival. Foreign traders might have actually introduced the diseases, but they'd usually disappeared by the time symptoms appeared. Military units might have carried infections, but attacking soldiers was dangerous. Physicians, however, were perfect targets. They were present during outbreaks, they possessed mysterious knowledge about disease, and they were typically outnumbered and defenseless against community rage. Korean epidemic medicine operated under the delightful principle that healing and harming were essentially identical activities performed by the same people with different intentions. Physicians who understood how diseases spread were obviously capable of spreading them deliberately. Healers who knew which herbs could treat symptoms clearly knew which substances could cause those same symptoms. Medical knowledge was inherently suspicious because it implied power over life and death that common people found threatening. The persecution of plague doctors took various creative forms that revealed impressive community coordination in channeling pandemic fear into anti-medical violence. Physicians might find their medical supplies contaminated or destroyed, their patients turned against them through whispered accusations, their travel routes blocked by hostile villagers, or their family members threatened with violence unless they abandoned their medical activities. Some communities developed elaborate conspiracy theories involving physicians deliberately spreading disease to create demand for their services, medieval Korean versions of disaster capitalism accusations. The quarantine practices that physicians attempted to implement often triggered the most violent responses from communities desperate to maintain normal social interactions. When Dr. Kim Song-il tried to establish isolation protocols during a 1456 smallpox outbreak, local residents accused him of using medical authority to control and manipulate community behavior for political purposes. They interpreted quarantine recommendations as evidence that he was working with government officials to restrict personal freedom and destroy traditional social relationships. Plague doctors faced particularly brutal persecution because their medical activities violated multiple social taboos simultaneously. Not only were they practicing medicine without proper authorization, but they were also moving freely through communities, entering homes unaccompanied, and interacting with male patients, all behaviors that traditional Korean society considered fundamentally dangerous. When epidemics struck, female healers became convenient targets for communities needing to blame someone for both the disease and the social disruption that accompanied their medical activities. The economic dimensions of plague doctor persecution revealed the intersection of medical practice and community resource allocation during crisis periods. Physicians treating epidemic patients consumed scarce medical supplies, food, and housing resources that communities needed for their own survival. During severe outbreaks, physicians became competitors for survival resources rather than providers of essential services. Communities would calculate whether supporting medical practitioners was worth the resource expenditure, especially when treatment outcomes remained uncertain. Buddhist monk physicians faced unique forms of persecution during epidemics because their religious identity complicated community blame attribution. When their medical treatments failed, they could be accused of either medical incompetence or spiritual contamination. Some communities developed theories that monk physicians had brought divine punishment upon the village through improper religious practices, while others claimed that their medical activities had polluted their spiritual purity and rendered their religious healing ineffective. The most psychologically devastating aspect of plague doctor persecution was its complete unpredictability. Physicians who successfully treated epidemic patients might face accusations of having caused the outbreak in order to demonstrate their healing abilities. Healers who failed to save patients were obviously incompetent or malicious. Even physicians who avoided treating epidemic cases could be accused of selfishly withholding medical knowledge during community emergencies. There was literally no medical response to epidemic disease that couldn't be interpreted as evidence of physician culpability. Some medical practitioners attempted to protect themselves from epidemic scapegoating by maintaining detailed written records of their activities, patient outcomes, and treatment protocols. They hoped that documented evidence of their dedication and competence would provide legal protection against accusations. Unfortunately, literacy itself became suspicious during epidemic periods. If you could read or write, you obviously had access to dangerous knowledge that might include information about causing diseases as well as curing them. The geographic mobility required for epidemic medical practice created additional opportunities for physician persecution. Healers traveling between affected communities could be accused of deliberately spreading disease from one location to another. Their arrival in new villages often coincided with disease outbreaks, creating perfect circumstances for post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning that transformed correlation into causation. Physicians learned to travel secretly and avoid admitting their medical background when entering new communities during epidemic periods. Remember those elaborate protective measures that court physicians developed to avoid poison accusations? Plague doctors needed even more sophisticated survival strategies because they faced threats from entire communities rather than individual accusers. Some physicians worked exclusively through intermediaries, providing medical advice without direct patient contact. Others adopted fake identities and practiced medicine under assumed names that couldn't be traced back to their real families and communities. The psychological impact on medical practitioners was profound and lasting. Even physicians who survived epidemic persecution often abandoned medical practice afterward, too traumatized by community betrayal to continue healing work. The medical profession lost countless skilled practitioners, not to disease, but to the violence and persecution that accompanied their efforts to combat epidemics. The Buddhist monk physicians of Korean dynasties occupied a uniquely precarious position in the medical landscape, practicing healing arts that were simultaneously revered as sacred wisdom and persecuted as dangerous heresy, depending entirely on which political wind happened to be blowing that particular decade. You're about to witness how religious medicine became a blood sport, where spiritual devotion and medical expertise could get you killed faster than either ignorance or atheism. Buddhist temples had served as Korea's primary medical centers for centuries before Confucian orthodoxy decided that mixing religion with healing represented a fundamental threat to proper social order. Monks had developed sophisticated medical practices, combining Chinese traditional medicine with Korean herbal knowledge, meditation-based therapeutic techniques, and surgical procedures that wouldn't be matched by secular physicians for generations. Their temple libraries contained precious medical texts, their gardens cultivated rare medicinal plants, and their communities provided the stable institutional support necessary for advanced medical research. Then came the Confucian medical inquisition, and suddenly every monk with healing knowledge became a potential enemy of the state. The logic was elegantly twisted. Buddhist medical practice implied that spiritual purity could enhance healing effectiveness, which suggested that Confucian scholars might be medically inferior to religious practitioners, which undermined the entire social hierarchy that kept Korean society functioning according to proper philosophical principles. Therefore, monk physicians had to be eliminated for the greater good of social stability. The persecution of Buddhist medical practitioners began subtly, with new regulations requiring monks to obtain special licenses for medical practice, restrictions on temple medical libraries, and limitations on the types of patients that religious healers could treat. But subtlety was never the strong suit of Korean religious persecution, and soon the campaign escalated to temple raids, forced relocations, and the systematic destruction of centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. Dr. Won Hyo, a monk physician practicing at Bulbuksa Temple during the early Joseon period, kept detailed records of the persecution campaign that destroyed his medical community. Temple officials would arrive without warning, confiscate medical texts deemed religiously inappropriate, interrogate patients about the spiritual content of their treatments, and demand detailed explanations of how Buddhist meditation practices related to medical diagnosis. Any answer could be interpreted as evidence of religious contamination of proper medical practice. The theological dimensions of this persecution revealed the impossible contradictions facing monk physicians. Buddhist medical theory emphasized the connection between spiritual well-being and physical health, incorporating meditation, ethical behavior, and religious devotion as essential components of effective treatment. Confucian medical orthodoxy demanded purely secular approaches based on classical Chinese texts with no reference to religious or spiritual factors. Monk physicians were essentially required to abandon their fundamental understanding of healing in order to continue practicing medicine. The practical consequences were devastating for Korean healthcare. Buddhist temples had provided free medical care to poor communities, maintained the only hospitals outside major cities, and preserved medical knowledge that would have otherwise been lost during political upheavals. When these institutions were destroyed or forced to abandon medical activities, rural Korean communities lost their primary source of health care, creating medical deserts that persisted for generations. Some monk physicians attempted to survive the persecution by secularizing their practice, removing obvious Buddhist elements from their treatments while maintaining the underlying medical approaches. This created bizarre therapeutic compromises, where monks would provide meditation-based pain relief while claiming it was simply breathing exercises, or offer herbal formulations developed through Buddhist medical research while attributing them to classical Chinese sources. The underground Buddhist medical network that emerged during periods of intense persecution resembled a religious resistance movement more than a healthcare system. Monk physicians would travel in disguise between hidden temple communities, sharing medical knowledge through coded religious ceremonies and maintaining secret medical libraries in remote mountain monasteries. They developed elaborate communication systems using religious terminology to discuss medical cases without revealing their illegal healing activities to government informants. Non-male. That his female Buddhist practitioners faced compound persecution that combined anti-religious sentiment with gender-based medical restrictions. Nun physicians were accused of corrupting both proper religious behavior and appropriate feminine roles through their medical activities. They supposedly used their religious authority to manipulate vulnerable patients, their medical knowledge to practice witchcraft, and their gender to seduce male patients through inappropriate physical contact during examinations. The economic warfare against Buddhist medical institutions was particularly sophisticated and brutal. Temples lost their tax exemptions if they continued medical activities. Their agricultural lands were confiscated if medical equipment was discovered on temple grounds, and their financial supporters faced persecution for funding religiously contaminated health care. The government systematically destroyed the economic foundation that had supported Buddhist medical practice for centuries. One of the most tragic aspects of this persecution was the destruction of medical texts and research that represented centuries of accumulated healing knowledge. Buddhist monasteries had served as libraries and research centers, preserving medical information through political upheavals and social changes that destroyed secular medical institutions. When temple libraries were burned or confiscated, irreplaceable medical knowledge disappeared forever. The psychological warfare against monk physicians was equally devastating. They were forced to choose between their religious vocations and their medical callings, between spiritual community and healing practice, between personal safety and service to suffering patients. Many monks abandoned medicine entirely, while others left religious life to continue practicing healing arts as secular physicians. Either choice represented a profound personal tragedy and a loss to Korean medical practice. Some Buddhist medical practitioners attempted to survive persecution by emphasizing the secular aspects of their healing knowledge while downplaying religious components. They would present themselves as physicians who happened to be monks rather than monk physicians, treating their religious identity as irrelevant to their medical practice. This strategy sometimes provided temporary protection, but required constant vigilance to avoid accidentally revealing the spiritual foundations of their medical understanding. The geographic isolation of many Buddhist temples created additional persecution opportunities for government officials seeking to eliminate religious medical practice. Remote monasteries could be raided without public scrutiny. Monk physicians could disappear without community protest, and medical libraries could be destroyed without witnesses. The very isolation that had protected Buddhist medical communities from political interference eventually became their greatest vulnerability. Remember those competing medical philosophies we discussed earlier? Buddhist medical practice represented a third philosophical approach that threatened both Chinese Orthodox medicine and Korean folk traditions. Monk physicians couldn't align themselves with either secular medical faction without betraying their religious principles, leaving them isolated and vulnerable to persecution from multiple directions simultaneously. The most successful monk physicians learned to become medical chameleons, shifting between religious and secular medical identities depending on political circumstances and patient needs. They maintained Buddhist medical practices within their religious communities while adopting Confucian medical terminology for interactions with government officials and secular physicians. The Japanese invasions of Korea between 1592 and 1598 transformed the medical profession from a dangerous but civilized occupation into something resembling a cross between combat medicine and a suicide mission, where physicians found themselves simultaneously treating war wounds, dodging samurai swords, and watching centuries of medical infrastructure burn to the ground around them. You're entering a period when being a doctor meant accepting that your medical bag might become your coffin, and your patients might be the enemy soldiers who just finished destroying your hometown. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi's armies swept across the Korean peninsula, they didn't just target military installations and government buildings. They systematically destroyed the medical infrastructure that had taken centuries to develop. Hospitals, medical schools, herb gardens, libraries containing precious medical texts, and pharmaceutical manufacturing centers all became strategic targets in a war that seemed designed to eliminate Korean civilization along with Korean resistance. Dr. Ryu Itai, practicing in Busan when the first Japanese forces landed, documented the complete collapse of medical normalcy in his journal entries from 1592. Within days of the invasion, his hospital had been commandeered as a military barracks, his medical supplies confiscated for treating Japanese wounded, and his Korean patients left to die untreated while enemy soldiers received priority medical care. The ethical dimensions of wartime medicine had always been complicated, but the Imjin War created moral dilemmas that would have challenged the wisdom of Confucian sages. Korean physicians faced impossible choices that would have broken the minds of modern medical ethicists. Should they treat wounded Japanese soldiers who might recover to kill more Korean civilians? Should they refuse medical care to enemy forces and risk execution for violating medical neutrality? Should they provide information about Korean troop movements to save their own lives? Or maintain patient confidentiality even when their patients were enemy combatants? Every decision carried life and death consequences for both physicians and their communities. The Japanese military's approach to Korean medical practitioners revealed a sophisticated understanding of warfare that extended beyond simple military conquest. They recognized that destroying Korean medical capabilities would cripple the population's ability to recover from war damage, create long-term dependency on Japanese medical resources, and eliminate potential Korean military medical support. Korean physicians weren't just collateral damage. They were strategic targets in a campaign designed to permanently cripple Korean society. Many Korean doctors attempted to continue practicing medicine by treating both Korean and Japanese casualties, hoping that medical neutrality might provide some protection from military violence. This strategy proved spectacularly naive. Japanese commanders viewed Korean physicians with suspicion, regardless of their willingness to treat enemy wounded, assuming that medical knowledge could be used for espionage, sabotage, or developing biological weapons. Korean medical practitioners found themselves suspected of being spies, collaborators, or resistance fighters, depending on which military faction they encountered. The destruction of medical libraries and educational institutions represented one of the war's most devastating long-term consequences for Korean healthcare. Centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, treatment protocols developed specifically for Korean diseases, herbal formulations adapted to Korean climate and diet, surgical techniques refined through generations of practice, disappeared in the smoke of burning temples and schools. Some physicians attempted to preserve medical texts by memorizing them, creating human libraries that could rebuild Korean medical knowledge after the war ended. Female medical practitioners faced particularly brutal treatment during the Japanese occupation. Their unofficial status provided no protection from military violence, while their medical knowledge made them valuable as forced laborers in Japanese military hospitals. Many were kidnapped and transported to Japanese military camps, where they worked as medical slaves, treating wounded soldiers under conditions that would have horrified medieval prison wardens. The economic warfare against Korean medicine was as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese forces systematically destroyed medicinal herb gardens, contaminated water sources used for pharmaceutical preparation, and disrupted trade networks that supplied rare medical ingredients. Even physicians who survived the initial military assault found themselves unable to practice medicine effectively without access to basic medical supplies. Korean military medical corps found themselves in the impossible position of treating their own wounded while constantly fleeing Japanese advances. Military physicians had to develop battlefield medical techniques using whatever materials they could scavenge, often treating traumatic injuries with improvised tools and expired medications. Dr. Kim Eung-soo's Military Medical Journal describes performing amputations using kitchen knives, treating infections with fermented rice wine, and suturing wounds with silk threads pulled from abandoned clothing. The psychological trauma inflicted on Korean medical practitioners extended far beyond the immediate war period. Physicians who witnessed the systematic destruction of their profession developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They'd lost their patients, their colleagues, their medical institutions, and their professional identity in a matter of months. Many never returned to medical practice after the war, too psychologically damaged to resume healing work. Some Korean physicians attempted to preserve their medical knowledge by joining resistance movements, using their medical skills to support guerrilla fighters, while maintaining underground medical networks in Japanese-occupied territory. This created additional dangers, as they faced persecution not only from Japanese military forces, but also from Korean collaborators who viewed resistance medical activities as threats to their own safety under occupation. The Japanese military's use of Korean physicians as forced medical labor created ethical dilemmas that would have challenged the most sophisticated moral philosophers. Korean doctors working in Japanese military hospitals were required to provide medical care that would enable enemy soldiers to return to combat and kill more Korean civilians. Refusing to cooperate meant execution, but compliance meant becoming accomplices in their own nation's destruction. Mobile medical units that had developed during the early stages of the war faced constant threats from Japanese patrols, Korean bandits who emerged during the social chaos, and Chinese military forces that viewed Korean physicians with suspicion. Medical practitioners learned to travel in small groups, hide their medical supplies, and develop rapid treatment protocols that could be completed before military threats forced them to flee. Remember those underground female medical networks we discussed earlier? The Japanese invasion forced these hidden communities into the open as desperate medical needs overwhelmed traditional social restrictions. Women who had practiced medicine secretly for decades suddenly found themselves openly treating war casualties, performing surgery, and organizing medical relief efforts. The war temporarily suspended gender restrictions on medical practice, but this freedom came at the cost of constant mortal danger. The refugee medical crisis created by massive population displacement overwhelmed the remaining Korean medical infrastructure. Physicians found themselves treating thousands of displaced civilians with minimal medical supplies, inadequate shelter, and contaminated water sources. Disease outbreaks in refugee camps often proved more deadly than direct military action, and Korean physicians working in these conditions faced mortality rates that rivaled frontline combat soldiers. The long-term consequences of medical infrastructure destruction during the Japanese invasions shaped Korean healthcare for generations. The loss of medical libraries meant that treatment knowledge had to be reconstructed from memory and fragmentary sources. The destruction of herb gardens required decades to restore medicinal plant cultivation. The death or displacement of experienced physicians created knowledge gaps that took generations to fill. The Manchu conquest of China in 1644 sent shockwaves across the Korean peninsula that transformed medical practice from merely dangerous into something approaching suicidal, as Korean physicians found themselves caught between their traditional Chinese medical allegiances and the new Qing dynasty orthodoxies that arrived with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge through a hospital ward. You're now witnessing how changing imperial loyalties could quite literally kill doctors who happen to be practicing the wrong type of medicine at the wrong historical moment. The Qing dynasty's rise to power created immediate medical crises for Korean physicians who had spent their careers mastering Ming dynasty medical texts, therapeutic approaches, and pharmaceutical practices. Overnight, centuries of accumulated medical knowledge became politically suspect, not because it was medically ineffective, but because it represented loyalty to the fallen Ming dynasty that Korea had supported during the Manchu conquest. Korean doctors discovered that their hard-earned medical expertise had become evidence of dangerous political allegiance. Dr. Song Shi-yeol, practicing in Seoul during the early Qing period, documented the impossible medical choices facing Korean physicians in his private correspondence. The new Qing medical authorities demanded adoption of Manchu-influenced medical practices, including different diagnostic techniques, altered herbal formulations, and modified theoretical frameworks that contradicted everything Korean physicians had learned during their medical education. Refusing to adopt these changes meant accusations of political disloyalty, but implementing unfamiliar treatments meant potentially harming patients through medical incompetence. The Qing cultural purge extended into medical practice with terrifying thoroughness. Korean physicians were required to demonstrate their loyalty to the new dynasty by publicly rejecting Ming Dynasty medical texts, destroying medical libraries that contained politically contaminated healing knowledge, and adopting Qing-approved medical terminology that often bore little resemblance to the treatment approaches they'd spent decades perfecting. It was like forcing experienced surgeons to perform operations using completely different anatomical terminology while blindfolded. Korean medical institutions found themselves trapped between maintaining effective healthcare and avoiding political persecution. Medical schools that had taught Ming Dynasty approaches for generations were forced to completely restructure their curricula, often with faculty who had no training in the newly mandated Qing medical orthodoxies. Students received medical education from professors who were learning the material at the same time, creating a generation of physicians trained in medical confusion rather than healing competence. The pharmaceutical chaos created by changing medical orthodoxies was particularly devastating for Korean healthcare. Qing medical authorities promoted different herbal formulations, altered preparation methods, and modified dosage protocols that often proved ineffective or harmful when applied to Korean patients. Korean physicians discovered that medicine which worked perfectly under Ming Dynasty protocols could become dangerous or useless when prepared according to Qing Dynasty requirements. Women, or female medical practitioners, faced compound persecution during this period because their unofficial status provided no protection from political purges, while their medical knowledge made them suspect to authorities seeking evidence of Ming Dynasty loyalty. Underground female medical networks that had survived previous persecution campaigns found themselves targeted for elimination, not because of their gender, but because of their association with politically contaminated medical traditions. The economic dimensions of medical orthodoxy changes were staggering for Korean healthcare. Physicians had invested fortunes in Ming Dynasty medical texts, pharmaceutical equipment, and specialized training that became worthless overnight. Meanwhile, acquiring Qing-approved medical materials required new financial investments that many practitioners couldn't afford, creating a medical system where political loyalty was literally more expensive than medical competence. Korean medical practitioners developed elaborate survival strategies that combined medical camouflage with political performance art. They would publicly burn Ming Dynasty medical texts while secretly memorizing their contents, openly praise Qing medical innovations while privately maintaining traditional treatment approaches, and demonstrate political loyalty through medical terminology changes while continuing to practice the same therapeutic techniques under different names. The persecution of Korean medical scholars who had published works supporting Ming Dynasty medical approaches created a climate of intellectual terror that paralyzed medical innovation. Physicians who had written medical texts, developed new treatment protocols, or engaged in medical research faced potential execution for intellectual crimes that had been considered scholarly achievements just years earlier. The medical profession learned that intellectual curiosity and professional innovation were potentially fatal character traits. Some Korean physicians attempted to survive the political transition by becoming enthusiastic converts to Qing medical orthodoxy, publicly denouncing their previous medical training and embracing Manchu-influenced healing approaches with the fervor of religious converts. This strategy sometimes provided political protection, but often resulted in decreased medical effectiveness, as physicians abandoned treatment methods they knew worked in favor of politically acceptable approaches they didn't understand. The medical examination system underwent radical changes that reflected political rather than medical priorities. Aspiring physicians were tested more extensively on their knowledge of Qing dynasty political history and their loyalty to Manchu cultural values than on their ability to diagnose diseases or treat patients effectively. Medical competence became secondary to political reliability in determining who could practice medicine. Korean medical communities that had maintained connections with Chinese medical institutions faced particular scrutiny during the Qing transition. Physicians who had studied in China, corresponded with Chinese medical scholars, or maintained professional relationships across national borders were automatically suspect as potential Ming Dynasty loyalists or foreign spies. International medical cooperation became a potential capital offense. The destruction of Korean medical independence during this period extended beyond individual persecution to systematic elimination of indigenous medical traditions. Korean folk medicine, traditional herbal practices, and locally developed treatment protocols were all classified as politically suspect because they represented Korean cultural independence that might extend to political resistance against Qing authority. Buddhist medical practitioners who had survived previous persecution campaigns found themselves facing renewed attacks during the Qing cultural purge. Their religious medical practices were now condemned not only as violations of Confucian social order, but also as potential centers of Ming Dynasty loyalty and anti-Manchu resistance. Monk physicians faced the choice between abandoning their religious vocations or risking execution as political criminals. Remember those elaborate medical protection strategies that Korean physicians had developed during previous persecution campaigns? The Qing cultural purge required completely new survival techniques because traditional methods of avoiding attention were inadequate against systematic political investigations. Korean doctors learned to become political chameleons as well as medical chameleons, shifting their expressed loyalties as rapidly as they changed their treatment approaches. The psychological impact on Korean medical practitioners was profound and lasting. Physicians who had devoted their lives to mastering Ming Dynasty medical approaches found themselves forced to publicly denounce their life's work as politically contaminated knowledge. The intellectual whiplash of changing medical orthodoxies created a generation of Korean physicians who learned to separate their public medical personas from their private therapeutic practices. Regional variations in Qing political control created additional complications for Korean medical practice. Areas with stronger Manchu administrative presence enforced medical orthodoxy changes more rigidly, while remote regions maintained greater tolerance for traditional Korean medical approaches. Physicians traveling between regions had to completely alter their medical practices and political expressions depending on local administrative preferences. The introduction of smallpox inoculation to Korean dynasties transformed what should have been a medical breakthrough into a political minefield so explosive that physicians practicing vaccination found themselves navigating between accusations of foreign infiltration, charges of practicing dangerous magic, and suspicions of deliberately spreading the very diseases they claimed to prevent. You're entering the bizarre world where preventing disease became more dangerous than allowing it to spread naturally. Smallpox inoculation arrived in Korea through Chinese medical channels during the early 18th century, carrying with it all the political baggage of foreign medical innovation in a society that viewed medical change as inherently threatening to social stability. The procedure itself was relatively simple, introducing material from smallpox pustules into healthy individuals to prevent severe infection. but the political implications were staggering. Korean physicians who advocated for inoculation found themselves accused of everything from foreign espionage to demonic possession. Dr. Lee Chae-ma, one of Korea's earliest inoculation advocates, documented the political firestorm surrounding vaccination in his detailed case records from the 1720s. His first successful inoculation of a government official's child should have been celebrated as a medical triumph. Instead, it triggered investigations into his political loyalties, his medical training sources, his financial relationships with foreign traders, and his possible connections to subversive political movements. Success in preventing disease apparently proved that he possessed dangerously advanced knowledge that threatened traditional Korean medical orthodoxy. The theological dimensions of smallpox inoculation created additional persecution opportunities for Korean medical authorities seeking to eliminate troublesome physicians. Traditional Korean medical theory emphasized that disease represented imbalances in natural harmony that should be corrected through gentle, gradual treatments. Inoculation deliberately introduced disease into healthy bodies, violating fundamental principles about medical intervention and natural order. Physicians practicing vaccination were accused of playing God, corrupting divine will, and interfering with celestial punishment mechanisms. Korean court officials developed elaborate conspiracy theories about inoculation that would have impressed modern anti-vaccine movements with their creativity and paranoia. Some claimed that foreign physicians were using inoculation to weaken Korean population resistance to future invasions. Others suggested that vaccination was a method for introducing foreign diseases that would create long-term dependency on foreign medical treatments. The most creative theorists proposed that inoculation was actually a form of biological warfare disguised as medical intervention. The class-based opposition to smallpox inoculation revealed the intersection of medical innovation and social hierarchy in Korean dynastic society. Aristocratic families who could afford traditional lengthy treatment protocols viewed inoculation as a crude, common approach, suitable only for lower classes who couldn't access proper medical care. Meanwhile, common families who needed effective, affordable disease prevention were prevented from accessing inoculation by regulations restricting the procedure to physicians with appropriate social credentials. Female practitioners who attempted to provide smallpox inoculation faced particularly vicious persecution because their medical activities violated multiple social taboos simultaneously. They were practicing unauthorized medicine, introducing foreign medical innovations, deliberately causing disease symptoms, and working with bodily fluids in ways that traditional Korean society considered fundamentally polluting. Female inoculators became convenient targets for communities seeking someone to blame for disease outbreaks, social disruption, or any other problems that coincided with vaccination activities. The economic warfare against inoculation practitioners was systematic and devastating. Physicians who advocated for vaccination found their other medical services boycotted by patients who viewed them as dangerously radical. Their medical supply sources were pressured to refuse service. Their students were recruited away by orthodox medical schools, and their professional relationships were systematically destroyed through whisper campaigns about their political reliability and medical competence. Korean medical authorities developed sophisticated arguments against inoculation that combined legitimate medical concerns with political paranoia and social prejudice. They correctly noted that inoculation occasionally caused severe reactions or deaths, but they ignored statistical evidence showing overall mortality reduction. They emphasized cultural contamination from foreign medical practices while dismissing evidence of inoculation effectiveness. They focused on individual treatment failures while ignoring population-level disease prevention success. The geographic distribution of inoculation acceptance created additional political complications for Korean physicians. Border regions with greater exposure to Chinese medical innovations showed more tolerance for vaccination, while interior areas maintained stronger opposition to foreign medical practices. Physicians traveling between regions had to completely alter their medical recommendations and treatment approaches, depending on local political attitudes toward medical innovation. Some Korean physicians attempted to make inoculation politically acceptable by disguising it as traditional Korean medical practice. They would describe vaccination using classical Chinese medical terminology, claim that inoculation represented ancient Korean folk wisdom that had been temporarily forgotten, or present vaccination as a refined version of traditional healing methods. These camouflage strategies sometimes provided temporary protection, but required constant vigilance to maintain the deception. The religious persecution of inoculation practitioners extended beyond Buddhist monk physicians to include physicians suspected of any spiritual contamination. Korean medical authorities claimed that successful vaccination required supernatural assistance, making inoculation practitioners suspect of practicing witchcraft, consorting with demons, or accessing forbidden spiritual knowledge. Medical success became evidence of religious deviance rather than professional competence. Korean court records reveal dozens of legal cases where inoculation practitioners faced criminal charges, ranging from practicing unauthorized medicine to attempting mass poisoning. The legal system treated vaccination as inherently suspicious activity that required extensive investigation and documentation. Physicians practicing inoculation learned to maintain detailed records, not just for medical purposes, but as legal protection against inevitable criminal accusations. The most psychologically devastating aspect of inoculation persecution was its complete irrationality from a medical perspective. Korean physicians who successfully prevented smallpox deaths through vaccination faced more professional persecution than physicians whose traditional treatments failed to save patients. Medical competence and treatment effectiveness became liabilities rather than assets in a system that prioritized political orthodoxy over patient welfare. Remember those medical philosophy wars we discussed earlier? Smallpox inoculation created new battlegrounds where traditional Korean medicine, Chinese orthodox approaches, and innovative foreign techniques competed for legitimacy. Physicians couldn't align themselves with any single medical philosophy without creating vulnerabilities to persecution from advocates of alternative approaches. The underground inoculation networks that developed during periods of intense persecution resembled secret societies more than medical organizations. Physicians would share vaccination knowledge through coded communications. They would practice inoculation in remote locations, away from government surveillance, and maintain hidden records of vaccination outcomes that could be used to demonstrate effectiveness when political circumstances improved. Korean families seeking inoculation for their children learned to navigate complex networks of medical practitioners, political informants, and social surveillance systems. Parents would secretly transport children to remote locations for vaccination, pay bribes to prevent official reporting of inoculation activities, and maintain elaborate cover stories to explain their children's temporary illness symptoms following vaccination. The long-term consequences of inoculation persecution shaped Korean public health policy for generations. The association between vaccination and political disloyalty created lasting suspicion of preventive medicine that persisted long after the original political circumstances had changed. Korean medical practice became permanently skewed toward treatment rather than preventive, with consequences that affected population health for centuries. And so, we arrive at the final irony of being a Korean doctor. Just when you thought the profession might finally become respectable, along comes Western medicine to make everything infinitely more complicated and dangerous. By the late 1800s, after centuries of dodging royal executions, plague accusations, and familial shame, Korean physicians faced their most existential threat yet, progress itself, wrapped in the deceptively cheerful package of missionary doctors carrying strange metal instruments and even stranger ideas about how bodies actually work. Picture yourself in 1885, a traditional Korean physician who spent decades mastering the delicate art of pulse diagnosis, memorizing thousands of herbal combinations, and perfecting the precise angles for acupuncture needles. You've survived the political upheavals, the social stigma, and the constant threat of malpractice accusations. Your practice is finally stable, your reputation somewhat secure. Then, some earnest American missionary arrives in Seoul with a leather bag full of surgical tools and starts performing operations that would have been considered witchcraft just decades earlier. And people are actually getting better. The first Western medical practitioners to arrive in Korea weren't just bringing new techniques. They were bringing an entirely different philosophy of medicine, one that threatened to make your life's work obsolete overnight. Where traditional Korean medicine emphasized balance, harmony, and working with the body's natural energies, Western medicine took a more aggressive approach, cutting things open, removing parts, and introducing foreign substances directly into the bloodstream. To a traditional physician, this wasn't medicine. It was barely controlled violence, masquerading as healing. Dr. Horace Allen, the first Protestant missionary to Korea, performed the kingdom's first Western surgical procedure in 1884, successfully treating a nobleman who had been stabbed during a political coup. The operation was a success. The patient lived. And suddenly, everyone in Seoul was talking about the miraculous foreign doctor who could heal wounds that would have been fatal under traditional treatment. For Korean physicians, this was roughly equivalent to watching someone solve a complex mathematical equation by hitting it with a hammer. Theoretically impossible, practically effective, and professionally devastating. The conflict wasn't just about medical techniques, it was about worldviews. Traditional Korean medicine was built on thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, philosophical frameworks that connected human health to cosmic balance, and treatment methods that had been refined across countless generations. Western medicine, by contrast, was built on dissection, experimentation, and a mechanical understanding of the human body that seemed almost barbarically reductive to traditional practitioners. Imagine spending decades learning to read the subtle variations in a patient's pulse, only to have some foreigner show up with a stethoscope and claim they can learn more about heart function in 30 seconds than you can in 30 minutes of careful examination. The royal court, always eager to embrace anything that might give them an advantage over neighboring powers, quickly became fascinated with Western medical techniques. King Gojong himself became a patron of Western medicine, establishing modern hospitals and inviting foreign doctors to train Korean students. This royal endorsement was simultaneously the best and worst thing that could happen to Korean physicians. It legitimized the profession in unprecedented ways, while also making traditional practitioners suddenly seem antiquated and possibly incompetent. Korean medical students found themselves caught between two worlds, often literally. Many were trained in both traditional and Western techniques, creating a generation of physicians who could perform surgery in the morning and practice acupuncture in the afternoon. This hybrid approach might sound ideal, but it created its own dangers. Patients who expected Western-style quick fixes became impatient with traditional treatments that required weeks or months to show results, while traditionalist families viewed Western-trained doctors with deep suspicion, sometimes to the point of violence. The introduction of medical schools based on Western curricula created another layer of professional conflict. Traditional Korean medicine had always been passed down through family lines or master-apprentice relationships, with knowledge closely guarded and slowly revealed over years of study. Western medical education, by contrast, was systematized, democratized, and relatively rapid. Suddenly, young men from merchant families could become doctors in a few years of intensive study, bypassing the decades of gradual learning that had previously been required. To established physicians, this wasn't just professional competition, it was professional heresy. Perhaps most dangerously, the clash between medical traditions often played out in life or death situations, where choosing the wrong approach could have fatal consequences. A patient suffering from what traditional medicine might diagnose as excess heat in the liver could actually be experiencing appendicitis, requiring immediate surgery rather than cooling herbs. Conversely, a patient whose symptoms seem to call for surgical intervention might actually be suffering from a condition that traditional medicine could treat more effectively with less risk. Getting this wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially lethal, and physicians on both sides faced accusations of incompetence or worse when their chosen approach failed. The professional tensions were exacerbated by cultural and religious conflicts. Many Western medical missionaries were also evangelical Christians who viewed traditional Korean medicine as superstition at best and devil worship at worst. They weren't content to simply offer alternative treatments. They actively campaigned against traditional practices, sometimes convincing patients to abandon treatments that had been working in favor of Western approaches that seemed more scientific. Traditional physicians found themselves defending not just their livelihoods, but their entire cultural heritage against foreign doctors who seemed determined to erase centuries of accumulated wisdom. The violence wasn't always metaphorical. In several documented cases, conflicts between traditional and Western-trained physicians escalated into actual physical confrontations, particularly in rural areas, where communities were forced to choose between competing medical authorities. There are records of traditional physicians being attacked by mobs, convinced that their backward treatments were preventing access to modern cures, as well as Western-trained doctors being driven out of villages by traditionalists who viewed them as dangerous foreign agents corrupting Korean culture. The Japanese occupation, beginning in 1910, added another devastating layer to these conflicts. The colonial government, eager to modernize Korea according to their own standards, actively suppressed traditional medical practices, while promoting Japanese versions of Western medicine. Korean physicians found themselves caught between their own government's preference for Western techniques and a colonial regime that wanted to control all medical practice within their empire. Being a doctor had always been politically dangerous in Korea, but now it was also culturally treasonous. You were either abandoning your heritage by embracing foreign medicine or resisting progress by clinging to traditional methods. By the early 20th century, being a Korean doctor meant navigating an impossibly complex professional landscape where every medical decision carried political, cultural, and professional implications. You could no longer simply treat patients. You had to choose sides in a conflict that would determine the future of medicine in Korea. The traditional physicians who had survived centuries of royal whims and social stigma now faced their greatest challenge yet, remaining relevant in a world that seemed determined to leave them behind, while somehow preserving the accumulated wisdom of generations in a profession that had always been, above all else, incredibly dangerous to practice. And perhaps that's the most Korean aspect of this entire medical evolution. Even progress came with its own unique set of life-threatening complications. And so we reach the end of our journey through the perilous world of Korean medicine, from ancient shamans dodging royal displeasure to modern practitioners caught between tradition and progress. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed centuries of physicians who chose one of history's most dangerous professions, in one of history's most politically volatile kingdoms, during some of history's most medically challenging times. Think about how far we've traveled together. From the earliest court physicians mixing herbs in secret, through plague doctors fleeing angry mobs, to traditional practitioners watching their ancient wisdom clash with foreign surgical techniques. Each generation of Korean doctors faced their own unique set of potentially fatal professional hazards. Yet, somehow, the profession survived, adapted, and evolved. The remarkable thing isn't just that Korean medicine endured these challenges, but that it managed to preserve its essential wisdom while embracing necessary changes. Those early physicians who risked everything to treat plague victims, the court doctors who navigated deadly political intrigue, the traditional practitioners who found ways to incorporate Western techniques, they all contributed to a medical tradition that remains uniquely Korean even today. Let these stories of resilient, resourceful, and remarkably brave physicians drift through your mind as you settle into sleep. Let the image of candlelit herb shops and ancient medical texts fade gently into whatever dreams await you. The dangers these doctors faced seem distant now, almost mythical, but their dedication to healing remains as relevant as ever. Rest well, knowing that the practice of medicine, however perilous, has always been fundamentally about hope. The hope that tomorrow's treatments might be safer, more effective, and less likely to result in exile or execution.